Hi, my name is Leilani Johnson. This week I watched the films Parasite and Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. Our focus is South Korean cinema this week, specifically their censorship issues. South Korea has had a very complicated and regimented past. From 1910 to 1945, their country was occupied by Japan. As a result of a lot of complications, none of the films made during that period survive today. These films had also been heavily cut, censored, and adapted to fit Japanese standards. After the war, Syngman Rhee, South Korea's first president, wanted very much to rejuvenate their film industry, so he made making films tax-free. That definitely worked. South Korea saw a big boom in their film industry, but in 1961, Park Chung-hee enacted the motion picture law. The number of production companies went from 71 to just 16 in 1 year. Mass consolidation. The number films that could be seen as remotely anti-government were also all heavily censored. The Korean Motion Picture Corporation was established in 1973 to, along with the enacted quota, that was meant to bolster the domestic economy rather than foreign ones, produced movies that were too fake and censored to be considered anything but propaganda. In 1993, South Korean cinema was at its lowest point commercially. Hollywood films were hogging the spotlight and the economy, and the only protection against this was the screen quota system. This required movie theaters to screen domestic films at least 146 days of the year. Nowadays, the screen quota system is still in effect, but it has been lessened to 73 days of the year. America has tried to abolish or at least lower the number of days, and the South Korean government has agreed, but South Korean citizens keep protesting against said changes, arguing that any further lowering of the quota will damage their fledgling domestic film industry. I would have to agree. It's really hard to compete against Hollywood, but especially with Netflix now, there's a lot of South Korean cinema is kind of boomed. I would argue that it's, definitely it surpasses the new wave that they had previously. Stuff like Squid Game on Netflix, it's a huge thing in American society right now. So, but that doesn't mean, lower the quota, because it might not always be relevant. So, on to our movies. Parasite by Bong Joon-Ho was released in 2019, and it made a big splash when it became the first non-English speaking film to win Best Picture at the Oscars. This was a big deal because it's probably the only film we've watched so far that was released during a conscious period of my lifetime. For years, I've really wanted to watch this movie, but I kept checking out because I read reviews that said it was quote-unquote disturbing. And I figured it was probably too much for me. I was quite wrong. It was disturbing in a way that was simply perfect for me. The film follows a very poor family, the Kims, that lives in a semi-basement in Seoul. The Kim's son, Ki-woo, gets an opportunity to interview to be the tutor for a rich family's daughter. His sister Ki-jung is talented at Photoshop and forges a university letter for him to use as credentials. He quickly gets the job and settles into the role in the house of the rich Park family. Quite quickly, Ki-woo and the rest of his family plot and scheme to take out others and all become employed under the Park family. Ki-jung gets a job as the Park family's son's art therapist/tutor. Ki-taek, their father, becomes the Parks' driver, and Chung-suk, their mother, becomes the Parks' housekeeper. One day, the former housekeeper, Moon-gwang, comes back when the Parks are away, and the Kims are all in their house, goofing off. She shows Chung-suk a secret bunker or basement level that only she was aware of, and apparently her husband lives down there because he's in hiding. Moon-gwang begs Chung-suk to slip her husband some food every once in a while and keep their secret. Chung-suk will not even humor her and threatens to call the police. The rest of the Kim family, who have all been spying on their conversation, tumble out and reveal themselves and their family relations, which they had been hiding from the Parks. Moon-gwang gets their whole inadvertent confession on video and uses it as blackmail to control the Kims. They break out into a physical altercation, and Moon-gwang and her husband end up unconscious and tied up in the basement. And that's only the beginning. Eventually, Da-song, The Parks' son has a big outdoor birthday party in their backyard, and Moon Gwang's husband, Oh Gwen-se, breaks out from the basement, almost kills Ki-woo, and successfully kills Ki-jung, until Chung-suk kills him in front of all of the Parks. Dong-ik, the Park family father, is vengefully stabbed to death by Ki-taek, who feels embarrassed at the way the Parks had talked about him and his smell behind his back. He escapes the party and the police and becomes a man in hiding. Ki-woo has a brain surgery operation and, months later, regains consciousness. He and his mother, currently on probation for their fraud, are being tracked by the police for information on where Ki-taek is hiding, but even they have no idea. Entranced by the Parks' house, which they quickly sold after the incident, Ki-woo spies on it and the new German family living there. Through Morse code, he figures out that his father is hiding in the same place Moon Gwang's husband was living in, and he is now effectively imprisoned there. Ki-woo vows to raise enough money to buy the house to free his father, and thus the movie ends, leaving you with the impression that that will never be possible. I don't think that counted as a quick summary, but I did my best. I think the main protagonist of this film was Ki-woo, but that could also be extended to the entire Kim family, who frequently acted as a unit of mischief. Their goal was to effectively act as parasites to the Park family to keep their relationship with them going as long as possible, to continue getting income from them and the ability to use their resources. They were initially quite successful until they weren't. They did not end up able to use those resources quite as long as they planned. The antagonists could be seen as Moon Gwang and her husband, Oh Gwen-se, because they were literally trying to murder the Kims. Their goal was to keep living in the bunker and continue their lives, but they were not successful, as they both ended up dead. Although Oh Gwen-se was crazy and he did get to kill someone, so that was cool for him. In this film, the lines were vague on who was bad and who was good. Everyone had justifiable motives for the acts they committed, so that makes it hard to define a clear antagonist. However, Moon Gwang and Oh Gwen-se were constantly in opposition to the Kims, so that's what defined their role for me. The title of the movie, Parasite, applies to every character in the film. The Kims were acting as parasites to the Parks, leeching off of their property and getting paid more and more with each infestation. The Parks were acting as parasites to the Kims, paying them to perform services that they were unable to perform, such as housekeeping, driving, and tutoring. Moon Gwang and her husband were parasites to the Parks, stealing food and using their resources unbeknownst to them. And Ki-taek becomes the defining example of a parasite at the end of the film when he becomes effectively trapped in the Parks' former house, using their resources, and crawls up during the night to steal food. The most interesting aspect to me, out of many, was how Ki-taek did eventually become imprisoned in the house that they had tried so hard to infiltrate. Another interesting storyline that I found interesting because they did not comment on it, just demonstrated it, was Ki-woo's relationship with Da-hai, which is only interesting because he was initially approached to be her tutor by her close friend who was leaving for a few months. He wanted his friend Ki-woo to take over as his tutor because he himself had feelings for her and was planning on asking her out when she became old enough. He trusted Ki-woo not to cross the line with her, and he ends up falling for her exactly like his friend did, and copying his language directly. He uses the exact words to describe her as his friend initially did, and I did not think that was very cool of him, and never is that addressed, but it was definitely on purpose. I think that the overall message of this film was that it is far too difficult and therefore effectively impossible for someone to ascend beyond their social class because of the treachery involved. And this takes place in modern day South Korea. It's a very modern film, and it's highly relatable because of that. I mean, they're trying to get Wi-Fi from various places of their houses in the beginning of the film. I mean, nobody before the year 2010 would even understand what the heck was going on. But still, I mean, it's a class struggle, which is timeless. I defy anyone to not enjoy watching this movie, regardless of if you like and identify with the characters in the film. It is largely a social class commentary and struggle, and it is convoluted enough with beautiful modern sets and music to inspire thought and entertainment alike. It is enjoyable to watch while also leaving you a lot to think about. So I said the same thing in 2 sentences right after another, but worded differently. I loved Parasite. I think it's a wonderful example of a film that never drags, is always interesting, with highly developed characters to the point where you don't know who to root for. I look forward to watching it again, and I would give it a 9 out of 10. The other film I watched was entitled Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. It was directed by Ki-duk and released in 2003, a year before I was. The story follows a young Buddhist monk from childhood to late middle age. One spring when he is a boy, he delights in capturing small animals, a fish, a frog, and a snake, and tying a rope around them with a rock attached to the end of it. He laughs with glee as he watches them struggle to swim. An older monk who he lives with is, unbeknownst to him, an observer of this cruelty, and when he is sleeping, the older monk ties a rope around him with a large rock tied to the end of it. The boy wakes up, and he is distraught. The monk tells him that he will not free him until he frees all of the animals he tortured, and if any of them have died, he will carry the stone in his heart forever. The boy struggles to the same places he went yesterday and finds the fish and the snake dead, and he cries until the scene ends. One summer, years later, the boy is a teenager/young adult. A mother and her teenage daughter visit their monastery to ask if the daughter, who is ill, can take some time to recover there. The older monk gladly accepts, and the mother leaves. The teenager falls for the girl, and eventually they develop a relationship. The older monk discovers when they fall asleep in his rowboat. He warns them that lust leads to a desire for possession, and possession leads to murder. The girl says she feels better, and the older monk says that it's time for her to leave. The teenager does not heed his master's warnings, and he goes after her. One fall, years later, the older monk catches an article in the newspaper about his former pupil, who is on the run after murdering his wife. He readies his monastery and retailers his old clothes to fit the student now. Sure enough, his former student shows up, filled with rage for his former wife. She had cheated on him, and he had murdered her. He cannot believe that she would betray him, and he attempts to commit suicide. His master beats him, furious that he would cheat himself of life so easily. He ties him up with candles slowly burning through his ropes to set him free with time. At the end of that time, he is calmer and goes outside to see the monk who has written the Heart Sutra in Chinese on the deck of their monastery. He tells his pupil that he must take the knife he used to kill his wife and carve out the characters that he wrote on the deck to take out the anger in his heart. 2 cops come to arrest the student, but the monk asks them to wait until the morning when he will be done carving. Calmed by the monk and his monastery, they agree to his terms. As soon as he is done carving, the pupil falls into a deep sleep. In the morning, the monk and the cops paint the characters orange, green, blue, and purple. The student goes willingly with the cops, and once he is gone, the monk, sensing the end of his life, burns himself to death while meditating on the rowboat. One winter far into the future, the former pupil returns to the abandoned monastery and finds his master's body frozen in ice in the rowboat. He digs out his teeth and places them in an ice statue he carves of the Buddha, where the third eye would be. He practices meditation and exercises in the cold. A woman comes to the monastery, masked, to drop off her child. She falls through the ice and drowns while leaving. One spring years later, the baby is now a child, and he resembles the other monk to a T. This boy takes delight in shoving rocks down the throats of small animals, and we see the cycle begin again. I'm sorry that was the longest thing on earth, but in a movie with so little dialogue, the plot ends up being quite complicated upon reflection, and details are very important. I would like to say, I just don't understand how that guy was released from jail and able to come back, because, I wasn't even completely sure it was him, because I don't know how he would get out. It was obvious it was once he was climbing the mountain and he was, reflecting on the animals that he had tortured. Obviously, he was the same guy. But how do they just let a guy out of jail for murder? I mean, straight up murder. Everybody knows he did it. She is very much dead. It was very much intended. I don't know. Maybe he escaped. I don't think that's very Buddhist of him. Maybe someone can help me figure that out. Anyway, the protagonist was an unnamed monk, the small boy that grew into a man. His goal was initially to be with the girl, which ultimately did not work out. Later, his goal was to grow into a monk like his previous master. In that, he seemed to have been successful. The antagonist was also the same person. One could argue that the girl was the antagonist because she led him astray, but I don't think so. I think that he was the protagonist and the antagonist because he was constantly working against himself. He wanted to be a Buddhist monk, but he couldn't let go of all the feelings inside him that were preventing that, and the impulses. Ultimately, he seemed to have become a master to the baby that was left at the monastery, but we don't know how good of a teacher he turned out to be. The film used a lot of symbolism, a lot of animals and Buddhist imagery. I don't think the animals were confusing. I don't know what they standed. Wow. I'm sorry. I'm very tired. Quite obviously. I don't know what they stood for, but it was obvious they meant something because they were so present. Sometimes the Buddhist symbols didn't make sense to me, like why he took the statue with him up the mountain. It's obvious it means something. I'm just not sure what. Upon Googling after watching the movie, I think the Buddha mostly stands in for his master and his teachings. I usually overthink stuff like that. Therefore, I would say that the symbolism wasn't usually confusing because it didn't mess with what was already there. It simply added to it. But there's no denying that it was a huge part of the story and its intended message. In my opinion, the film's message was that life is a cycle, and to reach enlightenment, you must come to terms with your emotions and temptations, transcend them, and become whole. The seasons also stand for cycles of life, different stages of growth, which all repeat itself. I mean, life is a constant circle all of the time. I don't think you have to be a Buddhist to understand that. What was interesting to me about the movie, it really disturbed me, it really shocked me to my core, this particular thing. So, okay, I knew that the baby that was left there was going to be the new kid and do everything that he did. That was pretty obvious, but they used the exact same child to play him, and for some reason that really shook me. Disturbed is the best word for how I felt. I felt kind of betrayed, and I do not know why, but we'll examine that in therapy later. All in all, I don't think I liked the movie. I didn't think it was bad. And I liked the concept and the minimal dialogue and emphasis on acting. I just didn't really like the story or the characters. I mean, I liked the old monk, and I enjoyed the scene where he has to carve out the Heart Sutra. I thought it was cathartic, and I liked the calming effect it had on the detectives as well. I thought that was cool. But I didn't really enjoy watching the movie, particularly after the second half. It simply didn't resonate with me as it would for someone who truly appreciated it. I don't understand why it'd be a 5-star movie. It's not like I disliked watching it. I read a bunch of reviews for it, and it's obvious that they idolize it, and I'm just never gonna get there exactly unless I have a huge internal transformation, which I'm very young, so I mean, could happen. But currently in my life, I would give it a 6 out of 10, I think. So, looking at South Korean films this week, I think I learned something, at least one thing. There was a question on the quiz that really piqued my interest. My mom likes to watch a lot of Asian cinema and television shows, and she always tells me she avoids stuff like thrillers from South Korea because the gore is so visceral and violent. One of the quiz questions asked if that wasn't because gun control laws are so strict there that guns are not commonplace. And I thought that was remarkable because I never once considered it. I grew up watching a lot of cinema, and I didn't realize that guns were mostly prevalent in American films with Asian actors, not Asian films themselves. Of course, there was swordplay in Asian films, but Robin Hood had that too. My Letterboxd top 5 changed for this week as it stands. Breathless is number 5, Ringu is number 4, Cinema Paradiso is number 3, Parasite is number 2, and Amelie is number 1. I think Parasite is very deserving of the number 2 spot. Hey, it's not gonna top Amelie because it's not very funny now, is it? And I find it hard to respect something without a sense of humor, but that doesn't mean it's not good. Although I will say, while I'm on the subject, if you don't have a sense of humor, I don't respect you at all. Anyway, Parasite is kind of a modern story, so it was easier to relate to. Cinema Paradiso is good. It's really good, but it's like an old-fashioned love fest, you know?